There is a version of this story that the official narrative has not fully explored, not because the evidence does not point toward it, but because following it requires asking questions that make people uncomfortable. Questions about what an 84-year-old woman living alone in an upscale Tucson neighborhood might have known, seen, or stumbled into that made her valuable enough to someone that they planned, prepared, and executed a sophisticated nighttime operation against her specifically. Not her daughter. Not her daughter's money directly. Her, Nancy Guthrie, a retired schoolteacher with a serious heart condition who could not walk to the end of her own driveway without stopping to catch her breath. The question that this investigation keeps returning to, the one that sits beneath every press conference and every carefully worded official statement, is a simple and deeply troubling one. Did Nancy Guthrie die for something she knew? Before we go any further into the details that have not been reported clearly enough, if you are the kind of person who needs the full picture and not just the headline version, subscribe to Brian Case Records right now. This channel exists for exactly this kind of investigation, deep, documented, and built around the details that matter most. Now let us establish something fundamental about this case that the surface-level coverage has consistently glossed over. The operation that took Nancy Guthrie from her home on the night of February 1st, 2026, was not impulsive. It was not opportunistic. It was not the work of someone who drove through a neighborhood and saw an easy target. Every documented piece of physical evidence points in the opposite direction. The masked figure captured on her doorbell camera moved with deliberate purpose. They knew where the camera was positioned. They understood how to place themselves in relation to it. Multiple neighbors in the immediate area experienced simultaneous internet outages that night, with Ring cameras going dark in the precise window when Nancy was taken. The surveillance footage showed the figure appearing to carry what investigators and experts have publicly discussed as a possible Wi-Fi jammer, a device that requires deliberate effort to obtain because it is illegal to sell or import in the United States. Someone did homework on that house. Someone knew the layout, knew the routines, and knew the specific vulnerabilities of that property before they ever set foot near it. The back kitchen door was left unlocked regularly, a detail known only among people who had spent time in and around that home. That detail was not advertised. It was not publicly available. It lived in the knowledge of a small and specific circle of people. And yet whoever came through that night navigated the property with a confidence that does not come from guessing. It comes from knowing. So when we ask whether Nancy died for something she discovered, we have to first establish that whoever took her already knew something about her. The knowledge ran in both directions. This was not a random targeting. This was a selected one. The ransom demand that arrived 36 hours after her disappearance, routed through an anonymous online tip form to KOLD, a local Tucson television station, demanded $4 million in Bitcoin. At first reading, the financial framing of the crime appears to answer the motive question. This was about money. This was a kidnapping for ransom. Case closed on the why. But when you examine the specific architecture of that demand alongside the evidence from the crime scene and the second note that arrived 4 days later, the financial motive begins to develop serious cracks. Consider the victim selection. If this was purely a financial operation, if the goal was to extract money from the Guthrie family, then the perpetrator made a series of decisions that are deeply inconsistent with professional ransom kidnapping. They selected an 84-year-old woman with documented serious heart problems. In the kidnapping for ransom world, victim health is a critical operational variable. A hostage who cannot survive the physical stress of captivity is not leverage. They are a liability. Professional kidnapping operations that are genuinely motivated by financial extraction select victims who can endure extended captivity because the negotiation process takes time. Days, sometimes weeks. The demand, the family's response, the FBI's involvement, the back and forth of proof of life and payment logistics. All of that requires a living hostage who remains viable as a bargaining chip throughout the process. Nancy Guthrie's documented health condition made her an extraordinarily high-risk choice for that kind of operation. Her heart problems were serious enough that walking a short distance caused her to stop and rest. The physical and psychological stress of being abducted, bound, and held would have placed an immediate and severe strain on her cardiovascular system. Anyone who had done basic research on Nancy before selecting her as a target would have known this. Her health was not a secret from people within her circle, which means either the perpetrator did not care whether she survived the initial hours of captivity, or survival was never the operational goal. The second note, which arrived at KOLD on February 6th, for days after the ransom deadline passed without payment, provides the most direct evidence for that interpretation. It stated that she perished shortly after she was taken. Shortly after. Not days into a negotiation. Not after a failed ransom attempt. Shortly after she was taken. If that language is accurate, and every major outlet has confirmed the core of it, then Nancy was gone within hours of leaving her home on the night of February 1st. The ransom demand that arrived 36 hours later was not a negotiation for a living hostage. It was something else. And the something else is the question that this investigation demands we sit with. What does a ransom note become when the person it claims to be holding is already gone? It becomes a performance. It becomes a document designed not to secure payment, but to secure time, to redirect the investigation, to create a narrative that sends law enforcement and the family looking in one direction while something else is happening in another. The $4 million demand, the Bitcoin wallet, the Sunday deadline, the escalation to $6 million, the or else. All of that language belongs to the genre of kidnapping for ransom. And it worked, at least initially, exactly the way genre fiction works. It made people read it the way they expected to read it. It produced the investigative response it was designed to produce. But here is what that performance required. It required the perpetrator to know, with certainty, that Nancy was already gone before they sent it. Because if there was any possibility she was still alive, sending a ransom note creates an obligation to follow through on the negotiation, to provide proof of life, to maintain the fiction long enough to collect payment. The ransom deadline came and went in complete silence. No follow-up, no escalation, no proof of life, no contact of any kind. The silence after that deadline was not the silence of a kidnapper regrouping. It was the silence of someone who had already done what they came to do and had no further use for the performance they had constructed. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through, because this is where the details get most specific and most important. So if the financial motive does not fully hold, what does? This is where the documented evidence and the specific details of how this operation was executed begin to point towards something more targeted and more personal than a kidnapping for ransom. The level of preparation involved in this crime suggests a perpetrator who had a specific and sustained interest in Nancy Guthrie's home, her routines, and her vulnerabilities. That kind of interest does not develop overnight. It develops through proximity, through observation, through access to information that lives inside a small circle. The first ransom note contained two pieces of non-public information that convinced the FBI to classify it as potentially credible. According to reporting source to people close to the investigation, the note correctly described what Nancy had been wearing when she went to bed on the night she was taken, not what she wore earlier in the evening when her family dropped her off, but what she had changed into privately, alone, inside her home. And it accurately described the location of a damaged floodlight in her backyard, a specific structural detail about the property that had not been made public anywhere. Those two details narrowed the credibility of the note dramatically. They told investigators that whoever wrote it was not a scammer chasing headlines. They had been inside that house, or they had obtained specific information from someone who had. Now consider what those details actually tell us about the perpetrator's relationship to Nancy and her home. Knowledge of what a person wears to bed is intimate knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge that comes from either physical presence in the home or from a sustained relationship with someone who has that physical presence. It is not the kind of knowledge that a financially motivated stranger develops through external surveillance of a property. A person casing a house for a ransom operation learns entry points, camera positions, alarm systems, and daily departure times. They do not learn what the target wears to bed. That specific knowledge implies a different and closer relationship to the victim than a purely financial motive can explain. The location of the damaged floodlight in the backyard is similarly telling. That is not a detail visible from the street. It is a detail you discover by being in the backyard, by moving around the property in a way that suggests familiarity rather than reconnaissance. Someone who knew about that floodlight had spent time behind that house, not in front of it, where a casual observer or external surveiller would position themselves, but behind it, in the private space of the property. When you place those details alongside the knowledge of the unlocked back kitchen door, a fact known only within Nancy's close circle, a picture begins to form of a perpetrator whose connection to this case is not the connection of a financially motivated stranger. It is the connection of someone who moved, or had moved, within the orbit of Nancy Guthrie's daily life. Someone for whom her home was not an unfamiliar environment. Someone who knew her routines well enough to know when she would be alone, what door to come through, where the cameras were, and what she wore when the day was over and she was simply herself inside her own walls. The question of what Nancy may have known or discovered that made her a specific target rather than a financially convenient one cannot be answered with certainty from the publicly documented evidence. But what the evidence does tell us is that she was not selected at random, and she was not selected solely for her daughter's financial resources. The preparation invested in this operation, the intimate knowledge deployed within it, and the almost immediate death of a victim who was selected despite her severe physical vulnerabilities all point toward a motive that is more specific and more personal than ransom. Whether that specific motive was rooted in something Nancy knew, something she had witnessed, something she had discovered, or something else entirely that has not yet surfaced in the public record, is the question that the investigation has not answered. And it is the question that the language of the second note makes more urgent, not less. Buried in nature now. We are truly sorry. The death was not intentional. Those three pieces of the second note's content are individually significant and collectively revealing. Start with the admission that the death was not intentional. In the context of a financially motivated kidnapping, an unintentional death is the worst possible operational outcome. It eliminates the leverage entirely. It converts a kidnapping charge into a murder charge. It destroys any possibility of payment. A perpetrator who accidentally kills their hostage has nothing to gain from communicating that fact to the family or to law enforcement. Admitting the death was unintentional does not reduce their legal exposure. It confirms that a death occurred, which is the primary fact the investigation needs established. The only reason to include that admission is psychological. It is the language of someone who needs the family to understand something about the nature of what happened, not to reduce their own culpability in a legal sense, but to manage how they are perceived by the people on the other side of that note. That is not the psychology of a professional criminal managing their exposure. That is the psychology of someone who is emotionally entangled in the outcome of what they did. Someone for whom Nancy Guthrie's death carries a weight that requires some form of acknowledgement, even an anonymous one sent through a local television station's tip form. That emotional entanglement is a forensic signature. It tells investigators something about the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. People who are psychologically distant from their victims do not feel the need to explain that the death was not intentional. They do not use the language of apology or sorrow. They either say nothing, or they use the death instrumentally, as in, pay us, or the same thing happens again. The second note in the Nancy Guthrie case does neither of those things. It apologizes, or comes close to apologizing, and then it offers to return the body for payment. That combination of remorse and transaction is psychologically specific. It belongs to someone who is carrying guilt and who simultaneously needs something from the family they took Nancy from. The decision to send the second note only to KOLD and not to TMZ or the second Tucson station that received the first communication is another deliberate choice worth examining. The first note was broadcast wide. 3 separate organizations received it simultaneously. That wide distribution served the purpose of the first note, which was to establish a public narrative around a kidnapping for ransom. The second note was different in content and different in distribution. It went in one place. To one specific person, KOLD News director Jessica Bobula, through the same anonymous submission system. That narrowing of the audience suggests the perpetrator was making a distinction between what they wanted the world to know and what they wanted only certain people to know. The second note was not a broadcast. It was a directed communication. And directed communications, even anonymous ones, carry the fingerprints of intent. The forensic linguistic analysis of ransom notes and anonymous communications is a well-documented field within the FBI's behavioral science unit. Every word choice, every punctuation decision, Every syntactic pattern in an anonymously authored document carries information about the person who wrote it. The phrase buried in nature now is not standard English phrasing. It is not how most people would describe a burial, even an improvised one. The word now is particularly unusual. Buried in nature now implies a present tense quality to something that has already occurred. It is as if the writer is situating the burial in an ongoing state rather than a completed action. That is a psychologically revealing construction. It suggests the writer is still mentally present at the location, still connected to the act, still orienting themselves in relation to it. That kind of present tense emotional positioning in the description of a past event is a marker that behavioral analysts take seriously. "We are truly sorry" is 3 words that a kidnapping operation motivated purely by financial extraction has no reason to include. Sorry to whom? The family? The investigation? The public? Sorry is an interpersonal word. It implies a relationship between the person expressing it and the person receiving it. In the context of an anonymous note about the death of an 84-year-old woman, sorry implies that the writer understood, at some level, that what they did to Nancy Guthrie was done to people who loved her. That awareness of the human web surrounding a victim is not the awareness of a stranger who selected her from a list of financially viable targets. It is the awareness of someone who knew that web existed because they had at some point been part of it, or close enough to it to feel its weight. None of this proves a specific theory about what Nancy knew or what she may have discovered that made her a target. The documented evidence does not extend that far, and responsible investigation of a case like this requires that the boundary between documented fact and inference be clearly marked. But what the documented evidence does establish, firmly and with significant forensic support, is that this crime was personal in ways that a purely financial motive cannot account for. The preparation was too intimate. The victim selection was too specific despite her health vulnerabilities. The post-death communication was too emotionally loaded. And the language of the second note is too psychologically particular to have been written by someone with no relationship to Nancy Guthrie beyond viewing her as a means to financial extraction. The investigation has returned to the notes by default, according to reporting source to people close to the task force. Every other investigative avenue has stalled or been exhausted. The notes are what remain. And within the notes, within the specific choices of language and distribution and timing, there is a portrait of a perpetrator that the FBI's behavioral analysts have been building quietly for months. That portrait is more specific than what has been said publicly, and the details embedded in it point toward a motive that is more personal, more targeted, and more disturbing than the kidnapping for ransom narrative that this case was initially framed around. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had serious heart problems. She lived alone in a quiet neighborhood and left her back door unlocked. She was, by every external measure, a woman who had moved out of the world of consequence and into the world of rest, of grandchildren, of ordinary evenings with family that end with someone watching her walk inside and closing the door. She was not a public figure. She was not a person with enemies in the traditional sense. She was a retired schoolteacher who happened to be the mother of someone very visible, very powerful, and very wealthy. And she is gone. And the person who took her knew exactly where the cameras were, exactly what door to come through, exactly what she wore when the day was done, and exactly how to construct a document designed to send an investigation in the wrong direction long enough to disappear. That level of knowledge about a person does not come from financial research. It comes from something closer. And what that something closer was, what Nancy may have known, said, seen, or discovered that brought that knowledge to bear against her in the worst possible way, is the question that this case has not yet answered. But the evidence is still out there. The notes are still being analyzed. The behavioral portrait is still being built. And the truth, wherever it is buried, is not as permanent as whoever put it there believes. This case deserves every resource, every investigative hour, and every public pressure that can be brought to bear on it. Nancy Guthrie deserves that. Her family deserves that. And the answer to what really happened on the night of February 1st, 2026, is still within reach if the investigation finds the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable, even if it leads somewhere close. If this investigation has kept you thinking, if these details have opened questions that the mainstream coverage never got close to, Then make sure you like this video right now and subscribe to Brian Case Records. Your support is what allows this channel to keep going deeper on cases like this one. Cases where the surface narrative does not hold and the truth requires real work to find. We are not done with this case. Not even close. Stay with us.